The charcoal stick in Eleanor Hartwell's fingers had worn down to a nub by the time the stranger's shadow fell across her sketchbook. But she kept drawing anyway, determined to capture the way the Arizona sunset turned the desert mountains into layers of purple and gold. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston to this dusty frontier town of Prescott in the summer of 1882, fleeing a life that had become suffocating in its predictability. And every evening since her arrival 2 weeks ago, she had positioned herself on this same rocky outcrop to sketch the changing sky. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made her pause mid-stroke, her heart quickening with the wariness that any woman alone in the wilderness learned to cultivate. But when she looked up, the man standing above her had eyes the color of weathered leather and a smile that seemed to understand something about her that she had not yet put into words. He removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair that needed cutting, and gestured to the sketchbook with a calloused hand. "That is real fine work, miss," he said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had spent years under open skies. "You have got the colors just right, even though you are working in black and gray." Eleanor found herself smiling despite her usual reserve with strangers. "The trick is in the shadows," she explained, tilting the sketchbook so he could see better. "If you understand where the darkness falls, the light takes care of itself." The cowboy crouched down beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something else, something clean like rain even though it had not rained in weeks. He studied her drawing with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he could see past the charcoal lines into the reasons why she had left everything familiar behind. "My name is James Cordell," he said finally, extending his hand. "Most folks call me Cord. I run cattle on a ranch about 10 miles north of here." She shook his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers, the strength in his grip that was tempered by gentleness. "Eleanor Hartwell. I am staying at the boarding house on Montezuma Street while I decide what comes next. Running from something or running toward something?" Cord asked, and the directness of the question should have offended her, but instead it made her laugh. "Both, I think," she admitted. "My father wanted me to marry a banker in Boston. A very respectable, very boring banker who collected stamps and talked endlessly about interest rates. I wanted to see if there was more to life than tea parties and calling cards." Cord settled onto the rock beside her, his long legs stretched out before him, his hat balanced on one knee. "And have you found it, the more you were looking for?" Eleanor looked back at her sketch, at the way she had tried to capture something wild and untamed, something that could never be contained in a parlor or a ballroom. "I am beginning to think so," she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades that shifted moment by moment. Cord did not speak again until the first stars began to appear, tiny pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. When he finally turned to her, his expression was serious, almost intense. "Draw our life together starting right now," he said, the words coming out in a rush as though he had been holding them back and could no longer contain them. "I know it sounds crazy. I know we just met, but I looked at your drawing and I looked at you and I thought, here is a woman who understands that life is short and beautiful and meant to be grabbed with both hands." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. No man had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and urgency. The banker in Boston had proposed with a prepared speech about financial security and social standing. Cord was offering her something else entirely, something she had not known she was searching for until this moment. "You do not even know me," she whispered, but her hand was already moving across the page, sketching the outline of two figures standing side by side. "Then let me know you," Cord said. "Let me show you this land that I love. Let me introduce you to a life that is hard and beautiful and real. If you decide after a month or two that it is not for you, I will personally escort you back to Boston and pay for your train ticket. But if you decide to stay, Eleanor Hartwell, I promise you that every single day will be an adventure worth drawing." She should have said no. She should have been sensible and cautious, and all the things that a proper Boston woman was supposed to be. Instead, she found herself nodding, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I will need more charcoal," she said, and the smile that broke across his face was brighter than the vanished sun. The next morning, Eleanor packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag and settled her bill at the boarding house, ignoring the raised eyebrows of Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, who clearly had opinions about young women who went riding off with cowboys they had just met. Cord arrived in a wagon pulled by two sturdy horses, his hat pushed back on his head, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he saw her waiting on the porch. "I stopped by the general store," he said, producing a box that contained at least 24 sticks of charcoal and several new sketchbooks. "Figured you would need supplies if you are going to draw our whole life together." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. In Boston, her father had considered her art a frivolous hobby, something to occupy her time until she found a husband. Cord, who had known her for less than 24 hours, had already understood that her drawing was essential to who she was. She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him, arranging her skirts as best she could, and they set off through the dusty streets of Prescott toward the open country beyond. The ranch, when they reached it several hours later, was not what Eleanor had expected. She had pictured something rough and temporary, a bachelor's cabin with little comfort or charm. Instead, she found a sturdy house built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch that looked out over rolling grassland dotted with cattle. There were corrals and outbuildings, a barn that looked recently painted, and a windmill that turned lazily in the breeze, pumping water into a long trough. "My father built this place 20 years ago," Cord explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "He died 3 years back, left it to me and my sister. She married a rancher over in New Mexico, so now it is just me and the hands who help with the cattle." A woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Eleanor up and down with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "So you are the artist girl that Cord has been going on about since he got back last night," she said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I am Maria Gutierrez. I have been cooking for this ranch since before Cord was born, and I do not tolerate nonsense or foolishness." Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "I do not plan on causing either," she said firmly. "I am here to learn about this life and to see if it suits me." Maria's stern expression softened slightly and she nodded. "Good answer. Come inside and I will show you where you can sleep. Cord, you get her bag and then make yourself useful fixing that fence in the north pasture that you have been putting off for a week." The room Maria led her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "It was meant for Cord's sister when she visited," Maria explained. "But she has not been back in over a year, so you might as well use it. Dinner is at 6. Do not be late or you will go hungry." Eleanor spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area around the house, her sketchbook under her arm, trying to capture the way the landscape seemed to go on forever, the way the light changed the colors of the earth from moment to moment. She drew the windmill and the barn, the horses in the corral, the distant mountains that looked close enough to touch but were probably miles away. When she returned to the house as the sun began to lower, she found Cord washing up at the pump, his shirt damp with water, his hair slicked back from his face. He looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, and when he saw her watching him, he grinned with boyish pleasure. "Find anything worth drawing?" he asked. "Everything," Eleanor said honestly. It is all worth drawing. Dinner was a simple meal of beans and cornbread and beef that was more tender than anything Eleanor had eaten in Boston's finest restaurants. There were 2 ranch hands who joined them, men named Tom and Jesus who spoke little but ate with focused determination. Cord told stories about cattle drives and wild horses, about summers so hot the ground cracked and winters when snow piled up past the windows. Eleanor listened, absorbing every detail, building a picture in her mind of what life here truly meant. After the meal, Cord took her back outside to watch the stars emerge in their thousands, more stars than she had ever imagined existed, and he pointed out constellations and told her their names, both the official ones and the ones he had made up as a boy. "Why did you really ask me to stay?" Eleanor asked when the silence between them had grown comfortable. "You could have any woman you wanted. You did not need to proposition a stranger with a sketchbook." Cord was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant horizon. "Because you were drawing the sunset like it mattered," he said finally. "Like capturing that one moment was the most important thing in the world. That is how I feel about this land, about this life. Every day matters. Every sunrise and sunset and everything in between. I wanted someone who understood that, someone who would not just endure this life but embrace it." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of fears she had not realized she was carrying. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and they stood together under the vast sky, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and logic. "I think I can embrace it," she whispered. "I think I might already be embracing it." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and right. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of roosters and the low murmur of men heading out to work. She helped Maria in the kitchen, learning to make bread and churn butter and prepare meals that could feed hungry cowboys. In the afternoons, when the heat became oppressive, she retreated to whatever shade she could find and sketched, filling page after page with images of this new world. Cord made time to be with her every evening, teaching her to ride a gentle mare named Rosie, showing her the boundaries of his land, introducing her to the rhythms of ranch life. He was patient with her mistakes, laughing when she forgot to latch a gate or fed the chickens twice in one day, and his laughter was never cruel, only delighted, as though everything she did charmed him. 3 weeks after her arrival, a problem arose that threatened the fragile peace of their developing relationship. A neighboring rancher named Silas Blackwood rode onto Cord's property with 3 armed men, claiming that Cord's cattle had broken through a fence and destroyed a portion of Blackwood's grazing land. "I want compensation," Blackwood demanded, a heavy-set man with a red face and small, mean eyes. $200 or 20 head of cattle, your choice." Cord stood his ground on the porch, his body tense but his voice calm. "My fences are solid, Blackwood. If cattle got onto your land, they were not mine." "Maybe you should look to your own herd before making accusations." Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "Are you calling me a liar, Cordell?" "I am saying you are mistaken," Cord replied evenly. "Now I will ask you politely to leave my property before this conversation turns unpleasant." Eleanor watched from the doorway, her heart racing, her hands clenched into fists. She had heard stories about range wars, about disputes that turned deadly over water rights and grazing land. She wanted to intervene to somehow diffuse the situation, but she also knew that this was not her world yet, not entirely, and that Cord needed to handle this in his own way. Blackwood stared at Cord for a long moment, then spat onto the porch steps, barely missing Cord's boots. "You will regret this, Cordell," he said. "You think you are so high and mighty, but this land will chew you up and spit you out just like it did your father." After Blackwood and his men had ridden away, Cord remained standing on the porch, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. Eleanor approached slowly, placing her hand on his arm. "Is he dangerous?" she asked quietly. "He is a bully and a cheat," Cord said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "He has been trying to expand his holdings for years, and he does not care who he hurts in the process. My father had more than one run-in with him before he died. What will you do?" Cord turned to look at her, and his expression softened. "I will keep my eyes open and my fences strong, and I will not let him scare me off land that my family has worked for 2 decades. He touched her cheek gently. "Are you having second thoughts? This life comes with challenges, Eleanor. Not everyone out here plays fair." Eleanor thought about Boston, about the safe, predictable life she had left behind, the life where the worst conflict she faced was choosing between tea services. "I am not afraid of Blackwood," she said firmly, "but I am afraid of what I would feel if something happened to you." The honesty of her words seemed to surprise them both. Cord pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart. "Nothing is going to happen to me," he murmured into her hair. "I have too much to live for now." That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the distant howl of coyotes, the creak of the windmill, the soft snorting of horses in the corral. She thought about the way Cord had held her, the certainty in his voice when he spoke about the future, as though their life together was already written and they were simply living out the pages. She thought about the moment on the outcrop when he had asked her to draw their life together, the audacity and romance of that request, the way it had cut through all her defenses and reservations. She was falling in love with him, she realized. Perhaps she had already fallen that first evening when he had looked at her sketch and seen past the charcoal to the woman holding it. The following morning, Eleanor asked Maria to teach her to shoot. The older woman raised her eyebrows but did not ask questions, simply fetched a rifle from the house and set up tin cans on a fence post. "The kick will hurt your shoulder if you are not ready for it," Maria warned. "Hold it tight against you, breathe out as you squeeze the trigger, and do not close your eyes." Eleanor missed the first 5 shots, the rifle feeling awkward and heavy in her hands, but on the 6th try she hit a can and sent it flying. The satisfaction she felt was unexpected and fierce. She practiced for an hour, until her shoulder ached and her ears rang from the noise, and when Cord returned from checking on the cattle, he found her reloading with Maria's patient guidance. He watched for a moment, then smiled. "Planning on defending the ranch?" he asked. "Planning on not being helpless," Eleanor replied, taking aim at another can. This time she hit it on the first try. Cord walked over to her, his expression serious. "You do not need to worry about Blackwood, I can handle him." Eleanor lowered the rifle and turned to face him. "I know you can. But I need to know that I can handle myself too. I did not come all this way to be protected and sheltered. I came to be a partner." The word hung between them, full of meaning. Cord reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "A partner," he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Over the next several weeks, Eleanor threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. She helped with the branding of calves, holding her breath against the smell of burning hide and trying not to flinch at the animals' cries. She learned to mend tack and chop vegetables, and recognize the signs of illness in cattle. She rode out with Cord to check fences and water sources, and he taught her to read the land, to see the subtle differences in vegetation that indicated underground springs, to notice the tracks of animals and understand their movements. Her hands, which had been soft and pale in Boston, became tanned and calloused. Her muscles grew stronger from the constant physical work. She felt herself changing, becoming someone she liked better, someone who was capable and competent and unafraid. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching another spectacular sunset, Cord turned to her and said, "I love you, Eleanor Hartwell. I have loved you since the moment I saw you sketching on that rock, trying to capture something beautiful because it mattered to you. I want to marry you if you will have me. I want to build a life with you that is exactly what you drew that first night." Eleanor felt joy surge through her, pure and uncomplicated. She had been waiting for this moment without realizing it, had been holding her breath for weeks, hoping that what she felt was matched by what he felt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, I will marry you, James Cordell. I will draw our life together and live it beside you and never look back." He kissed her then, his lips warm and sure against hers, his hands cupping her face as though she were something precious. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, full of promise and passion and the certainty of rightness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cord rested his forehead against hers. "We will do it properly," he said. "I will take you into town tomorrow and we will see the preacher and set a date. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Prescott, with Maria and the ranch hands as witnesses and half the town in attendance, curious to see the Eastern woman who had captured the heart of one of their most eligible bachelors. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Maria had helped her sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Cord had picked for her that morning. As she walked down the aisle toward where he stood waiting, tall and handsome in a new suit that he clearly found uncomfortable, she felt a sense of absolute certainty. This was right. This was what she had been running toward when she left Boston. This man, this life, this wild and beautiful place that asked everything of her and gave back even more. The preacher, an elderly man with kind eyes, pronounced them husband and wife, and Cord kissed her again, this time in front of the entire congregation, and she did not care that people were watching, did not care about propriety or decorum. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and hope she felt, and the church erupted in applause and laughter. At the reception in the church hall, there was fiddle music and dancing and more food than Eleanor had thought the small town could produce. Cord whirled her around the floor, both of them laughing, and when they finally left in the wagon decorated with ribbons and tin cans, heading back to the ranch that was now truly her home, Eleanor felt drunk on happiness. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and beautiful, a fumbling discovery of each other that left them both breathless and amazed. Cord was patient with her inexperience, guiding her gently, and when they finally came together, Eleanor understood for the first time what it meant to be truly joined with another person, body and soul. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking in whispers about their dreams and fears, about the life they would build together. "I want children," Cord said, his hand resting on her stomach. "At least 3 or 4. I want this house filled with noise and laughter." "I want that too," Eleanor agreed. "But I also want to keep drawing. I want to document this life we are creating so that someday our grandchildren will be able to see what it was like." "You will draw," Cord promised. "I will make sure you always have time for your art. It is part of who you are, and I fell in love with all of you, not just the parts that are convenient." The words made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears, and she kissed him again, pouring all her gratitude and love into the gesture. They made love a second time, with more confidence and less haste, and when they finally fell asleep as dawn was breaking, Eleanor felt more at peace than she had ever felt in her life. The first months of their marriage were a period of adjustment and joy. Eleanor learned to balance the demands of running a household with her need to create art. She sketched constantly, building a visual record of their life together. She drew Cord working with the cattle, his muscles straining as he wrestled a calf to the ground for branding. She drew Maria in the kitchen, her capable hands kneading dough. She drew the landscape in all its moods, from the harsh beauty of noon when the sun bleached everything to pale gold, to the soft mystery of evening when shadows lengthened and the world seemed to hold its breath. She sent some of her sketches to a cousin in Boston who had connections in the publishing world, and to her amazement, a magazine expressed interest in running a series about life in the Arizona Territory. The payment they offered was modest but meaningful, and Cord was proud of her accomplishment, showing the magazine to everyone who visited the ranch. In the spring of 1883, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, a gradual understanding of changes in her body, the nausea that plagued her mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, the bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. When she finally told Cord, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with delight, then immediately set her down and apologized, worried that he had hurt her or the baby. His protectiveness was endearing and sometimes annoying, as he tried to prevent her from doing any of the heavy work she had grown accustomed to. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she reminded him repeatedly, but she was secretly touched by his concern. Maria took charge of preparing for the baby's arrival, gathering supplies and advice from other women in the area. Eleanor continued to sketch, finding inspiration in the changes happening within her own body, trying to capture the strange and wonderful experience of carrying a new life. She drew her growing belly, the way her hands looked resting on the curve of it, protective and wondering. She drew Cord talking to her stomach, his lips moving in whispered promises to the child within. These sketches were private, meant only for their family, a record of this precious time. The baby arrived in late November during a cold snap that frosted the windows and made the wind howl around the corners of the house. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Eleanor thought she could not endure another contraction, another wave of pain that seemed to split her in two. Maria stayed with her throughout, offering encouragement and cool cloths for her forehead, while Cord paced outside the bedroom door, his footsteps a constant presence. When the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, Maria wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed him in Eleanor's arms. "A son," she said, her voice warm with approval. "A strong, healthy son." Eleanor looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and felt love crash over her like a wave. This was her child, hers and Cord's, a physical manifestation of their commitment to each other. When Cord was finally allowed into the room, his eyes were wet with tears, and he sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Eleanor, one finger gently touching the baby's hand. "He is amazing," Cord whispered. "You are amazing. I cannot believe we made him." They named him Thomas after Cord's father and called him Tommy. The baby transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. Eleanor had thought she understood exhaustion, but the sleepless nights of caring for a newborn took her to new levels of weariness. She had thought she understood love, but the fierce protective instinct she felt for Tommy was unlike anything she had experienced before. She sketched him constantly, trying to capture the rapid changes as he grew from a helpless newborn to a baby who could smile and coo and grasp at objects. Cord was a devoted father, taking Tommy with him in a sling as he did chores, talking to the baby constantly about horses and cattle and the land they would someday inherit together. During this time, the situation with Sela's Blackwood deteriorated. There were incidents of fences being cut, water sources diverted, cattle going missing. Cord suspected Blackwood's involvement, but had no proof, and the territorial authorities were too far away and too understaffed to care about disputes between ranchers. One evening in early spring, when Tommy was 4 months old, one of the ranch hands rode in with news that a section of Cord's herd had been driven onto Blackwood's land, and Blackwood was now claiming them as his own. Cord's jaw tightened with anger, and he immediately began saddling his horse. "I am going to settle this once and for all," he said grimly. Eleanor, who had been nursing Tommy in the rocking chair, quickly handed the baby to Maria and followed Cord to the barn. "Do not go alone," she said urgently. "Take Tom and Jesus with you. Blackwood is not going to back down, and I do not trust him not to turn violent." "I am not afraid of Blackwood," Cord said, but his eyes were worried when he looked at her. "But you are right. This needs to be handled carefully." He kissed her quickly, fiercely. "Stay here and take care of our son. I will be back before dark." Eleanor watched him ride off with the two ranch hands, her stomach churning with anxiety. She tried to distract herself with chores, with caring for Tommy, but her mind kept conjuring worst-case scenarios. What if Blackwood shot Cord? What if this escalated into a full-blown range war? She had not come all this way, had not built this life, to lose it to a bully with a grudge. As the afternoon wore on and Cord did not return, her anxiety grew into genuine fear. She checked the rifle to make sure it was loaded and kept it near the door, telling herself she was being paranoid but unable to shake the sense of impending danger. Cord returned just as the sun was setting, his face grim but his body intact. Eleanor ran to him, throwing her arms around him, feeling the tension in his muscles. "What happened?" she demanded. "We confronted Blackwood on his land," Cord said, his voice tired. "He had my cattle penned up, bold as brass, claiming he had found them wandering. I told him he had 24 hours to return them, or I would involve the territorial marshal, even if I had to ride all the way to Tucson to file a complaint." He laughed at me, Eleanor. He actually laughed, like the law does not apply to him. "What did you do?" "I told him that if my cattle were not returned by noon tomorrow, I would take them back myself, and I would bring every rancher in the territory who is sick of his tactics." That seemed to get his attention. He is a coward at heart. He relies on intimidation, but when faced with real opposition, he backs down. The next day, Cord's cattle were returned, driven onto his land by Blackwood's men without comment or apology. It was a small victory, but it felt significant, a turning point in the ongoing struggle. Other ranchers in the area, emboldened by Cord's stand, began to push back against Blackwood's encroachments, forming a loose coalition to protect their interests. Eleanor was proud of her husband, proud of the way he had stood up for what was right without resorting to violence, and she told him so that night as they lay in bed, Tommy sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. "You are a good man, James Cordell," she whispered. "Our son is lucky to have you as a father." "I am lucky to have you as a wife," Cord replied, pulling her close. "You make me want to be better, to build something that lasts." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and small triumphs. The ranch prospered as cattle prices remained stable, and Cord's reputation as an honest dealer grew. Eleanor's sketches continued to be published in Eastern magazines, bringing in supplemental income and a small measure of fame. She began to take commissions, drawing portraits of families and landscapes for people in Prescott and the surrounding areas. Tommy grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's brown hair and his mother's gray eyes, endlessly curious about the world around him. When he was 2, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. She gave birth to a daughter in the summer of 1885, a tiny girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the entire household. They named her Sarah, after Eleanor's mother, and Tommy was initially suspicious of the newcomer who commanded so much attention. But within days, he had become fiercely protective of his baby sister. Life settled into a pattern that felt permanent, as though they had finally found the rhythm they were meant to live by. Cord expanded the ranch, buying additional land from a neighbor who wanted to retire and move back east. Eleanor set up a proper studio in one of the outbuildings, a space where she could work without interruption when Maria watched the children. Tommy started learning to ride, perched in front of his father on the saddle, squealing with delight as they trotted around the corral. Sarah learned to walk early, driven by her determination to keep up with her older brother, and the house was constantly filled with the sound of children's laughter and occasional tears. In the fall of 1886, a telegram arrived from Boston that changed everything. Eleanor's father had died suddenly of a heart attack, and her younger brother was contesting the will, trying to claim Eleanor's inheritance for himself on the grounds that she had abandoned the family. The lawyer handling the estate requested Eleanor's presence in Boston to settle the matter. Eleanor read the telegram 3 times, her emotions tangled and complicated. She had not spoken to her father since leaving Boston 4 years earlier, had sent only a few brief letters to let him know she was alive and well. Part of her felt guilty for the estrangement, but a larger part of her was still angry at the way he had tried to control her life, to force her into a marriage that would have killed her spirit. "You need to go," Cord said when she showed him the telegram. "You need to settle this and get what is rightfully yours. Your father may not have supported your choices, but he would not have wanted your brother to cheat you out of your inheritance." "I do not want to leave you and the children," Eleanor protested. "And it is a long journey. I would be gone for weeks, maybe months." "Then I will come with you," Cord said firmly. "We will all go. The ranch can survive without me for a while. Tom and Jesus are capable men, and Maria knows this place as well as I do. This is important, Eleanor. Your family may not have understood you, but they are still your family, and you deserve to have closure." The trip to Boston was arduous, involving a bone-rattling stagecoach ride to the nearest railroad, then days on trains that seemed to crawl across the vast distances of the country. Tommy and Sarah were alternately fascinated and cranky, overwhelmed by the noise and crowds and constant motion. Eleanor felt increasingly out of place as they traveled east, as the landscape changed from open desert to dense forest to crowded cities. When they finally arrived in Boston in late October, the city she had fled 4 years earlier felt foreign and claustrophobic. The buildings too tall, the streets too narrow, the people too many. Cord looked distinctly uncomfortable in his best suit, his tanned face and calloused hands marking him as an outsider, and the children clung to Eleanor's skirts, frightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. The meeting with the lawyer was tense and formal. Eleanor's brother, Edward, was there with his own lawyer, his face pinched with disapproval as he looked at Eleanor and her family. "You abandoned father when he needed you most," Edward said coldly. "You ran off to play cowgirl in the wilderness, and now you want to claim your share of his estate. You have no right." Eleanor felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I left because father tried to force me into a marriage I did not want. I left because I needed to find my own path. That does not mean I stopped being his daughter or that I should be punished for choosing my own life." The lawyer, a dry man named Harrison, cleared his throat. "The will is quite clear, Mr. Hartwell divided his estate equally between his 3 children, with no conditions attached. Miss Hartwell, now Mrs. Cordell, is entitled to 1/3 of the estate, which includes a share of the house, the investments, and the business holdings." Edward's face reddened with fury. "This is outrageous. She does not even live in Boston anymore. What is she going to do with a share of a house 3,000 miles away?" "That is my concern, not yours," Eleanor said sharply. "I will decide what to do with my inheritance, and it is none of your business how I choose to use it." The meeting ended with an agreement to sell the family house and divide the proceeds, along with liquidating other shared assets. The process would take time, requiring Eleanor to remain in Boston for at least several weeks. Cord found them lodging in a boarding house, a respectable establishment that nonetheless felt cramped and airless after the open spaces of Arizona. Eleanor spent her days meeting with lawyers and bankers, signing documents, making decisions about property she had never expected to inherit. The money would be substantial, enough to significantly expand the ranch, to hire more workers, to build a bigger house and secure their children's futures. But the emotional cost was high, as she confronted the reality that her father had died without ever reconciling with her, without ever meeting his grandchildren or understanding the life she had built. One evening, as she sat in their rented room with Tommy asleep on her lap and Sarah curled against Cord's chest, Eleanor began to cry great gasping sobs that she could not control. Cord reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Talk to me," he said softly. "I am sad and angry and relieved all at once," Eleanor choked out. "I am sad that my father died without us making peace. I am angry that he was so stubborn that he could not see past his own expectations to value what I actually wanted. And I am relieved that I do not have to pretend anymore, that I can stop feeling guilty for choosing my own happiness." "Your father made his choices, just as you made yours," Cord said. "You cannot carry his regrets for him, Eleanor. You gave him opportunities to be part of your life, to know his grandchildren. He chose not to take them. That is his loss, not your failure." The words were exactly what Eleanor needed to hear, and she leaned against her husband, drawing strength from his solid presence. They stayed in Boston for 6 more weeks, until all the legal matters were settled and Eleanor had her share of the inheritance secured in a bank account. On their last day in the city, she took Cord and the children to visit her father's grave. She stood looking at the headstone, holding Sarah in her arms while Tommy gripped Cord's hand, and she said a silent goodbye to the man who had given her life but could not give her freedom. Then she turned her back on the grave and walked away, ready to return to the home she had chosen. The journey back to Arizona was easier than the journey east, perhaps because they were traveling towards something rather than away from something. The children were more accustomed to train travel, and Eleanor felt her spirits lift as they moved west, as the landscape opened up and the sky grew bigger. When they finally arrived back at the ranch in early December, Maria greeted them with tears and fierce hugs, and Tom and Jesus reported that the cattle had thrived in Cord's absence, and there had been no trouble from Blackwood or anyone else. Eleanor walked through the house touching familiar objects, reacquainting herself with the place that had become more home to her than Boston had ever been. That night, she and Cord stood on the porch watching the stars, and she felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "I am home," she said simply, and Cord pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. With the inheritance money, Cord hired additional ranch hands and bought more cattle, expanding the operation significantly. Eleanor commissioned the construction of a larger house, one with enough space for their growing family and with a dedicated room for her studio, complete with large windows that provided excellent natural light. The new house took nearly a year to build, rising slowly from the desert floor, constructed of adobe and timber harvested from the mountains. Eleanor supervised the project closely, insisting on specific details that would make the house not just functional but beautiful. She wanted high ceilings to keep the rooms cool in summer, a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, fireplaces in every room for the cold winter nights, and built-in bookshelves for the collection of books she planned to accumulate. When the house was finally finished in the fall of 1887, they moved in with a sense of ceremony, carrying their belongings across the yard from the old house to the new one, the children racing ahead in excitement. Tommy was 5 now, old enough to help with simple ranch tasks, and he followed his father everywhere, absorbing lessons about animal husbandry and land management. Sarah, at 2, was a whirlwind of energy and determination, constantly getting into mischief and making everyone laugh with her antics. Eleanor sketched them constantly, trying to capture the fleeting moments of their childhood, knowing how quickly time was passing. She also began work on a more ambitious project, a series of paintings rather than sketches, large canvases that depicted scenes from their life in vivid color. She had to order special paints and brushes from San Francisco, expensive supplies that she could now afford thanks to the inheritance, and she threw herself into the work with passion. The paintings were different from her sketches, bolder and more expressive, and Cord said they captured something essential about the West that he had never seen depicted before. In 1888, Eleanor became pregnant for the third time, and this pregnancy was harder than the previous two, plagued by persistent nausea and fatigue that lasted well into the second trimester. The baby was born in March of 1889, another son, larger than Tommy or Sarah had been, with a full head of red gold hair that seemed to come from nowhere in either family's ancestry. They named him Benjamin, and he was a quiet baby, content to observe the world with solemn blue eyes. Tommy was thrilled to have a brother, having grown weary of Sarah's bossiness, and he appointed himself Benjamin's protector and teacher. The three children together filled the new house with noise and chaos and joy, and Eleanor sometimes stood in the doorway of her room just watching them play, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had built. Silas Blackwood died in the spring of 1890, kicked by a horse and dead before anyone could fetch a doctor. The news spread quickly through the territory, and there was a general sense of relief among the ranchers who had borne the brunt of his aggression. His son, who inherited the property, was a milder man, more interested in cooperation than conflict, and he reached out to Cord and the other ranchers to establish better relationships. The coalition that Cord had helped form became more formal, with regular meetings to discuss shared concerns like water rights, cattle diseases, and the best prices for selling their herds. Cord's leadership was recognized and respected, and he took on the role of mediator when disputes arose, using his fairness and common sense to find solutions that satisfied all parties. Eleanor's work continued to evolve and gain recognition. A gallery in San Francisco expressed interest in showing her paintings, and in the fall of 1890, she and Cord traveled there for the opening, leaving the children in Maria's capable care. The gallery show was a success, with several paintings selling for prices that astonished Eleanor. Critics praised her ability to capture the raw beauty and harsh reality of Western life, noting that her perspective as a woman brought a different sensibility to the subject matter. Cord was proud and supportive, standing beside her at the opening and shaking hands with admirers, his discomfort in formal settings overcome by his desire to support his wife's achievements. They spent a week in San Francisco exploring the city, eating at fine restaurants, attending the theater, and Eleanor enjoyed the brief return to civilization, but she was also eager to get home to the children and the ranch. The city was entertaining, but it was no longer where she belonged. The decade of the 1890s brought continued prosperity and stability. The ranch grew to nearly 10,000 acres, supporting a herd of several thousand cattle. Cord hired a foreman to help manage the operation, allowing him more time with his family and to pursue other interests, including serving on the territorial council that was working toward statehood for Arizona. Eleanor's art career flourished, with regular exhibitions in San Francisco and even one in New York, where her paintings of the West were celebrated as authentic and powerful. She continued to sketch daily, filling book after book with images of her family and the land they called home. Tommy grew into a serious, responsible boy who clearly worshipped his father and was being groomed to eventually take over the ranch. Sarah became a skilled horsewoman, fearless and independent, insisting on wearing split skirts that scandalized the more conservative women in town. Benjamin was quieter than his siblings, bookish and thoughtful, more interested in reading and drawing than in ranch work, and Eleanor saw aspects of herself in him. In 1895, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise as she had thought her childbearing years were behind her at the age of 37. The pregnancy was difficult, with complications that required extended bed rest, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she might not survive the birth. But in February of 1896, she delivered a healthy daughter whom they named Grace. The baby seemed like a miracle, a late blessing, and the entire family doted on her. Tommy, now 14, was almost embarrassed by his affection for his baby sister. Sarah, at 11, took on the role of second mother, constantly holding and fussing over Grace. Benjamin, at nearly 7, drew endless pictures of the new baby, trying to capture her tiny features. Cord, now in his mid-40s, was transformed by Grace's arrival, becoming even more tender and patient than he had been with the other children, as though he knew this was likely his last chance to experience the wonder of infancy. As the century drew to a close, Eleanor often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about the young woman she had been in 1882, sketching a sunset on a rocky outcrop, running away from a life that felt like a cage. She thought about the cowboy who had approached her and asked her to draw their life together, the audacity and romance of that moment. She had done exactly what he asked, capturing their life in hundreds of sketches and paintings, documenting every stage of their journey together. The walls of their house were covered with her work, a visual history of their family and their ranch, and she knew that long after she was gone, these images would remain, testament to a life fully lived. In 1900, Cord was elected to represent their district in the territorial legislature, a position that required him to spend several months each year in Phoenix. Eleanor and the younger children accompanied him, while Tommy, now 18 and capable, remained behind to run the ranch with the foreman's guidance. Phoenix was growing rapidly, transforming from a dusty town into a real city, and Eleanor found herself moving in social circles she had never anticipated, attending dinners and receptions, meeting politicians and businessmen and their wives. She used her position to advocate for causes she cared about, including better schools and support for women artists. She organized an exhibition of work by female artists from across the territory, using her own fame to draw attention to other talented women whose work had been overlooked or dismissed. Sarah, now 16 and stunningly beautiful, attracted the attention of numerous young men, but she showed little interest in settling down, declaring that she intended to see more of the world before making any commitments. Benjamin, at 12, had developed into a talented artist in his own right, his drawings showing a sophistication beyond his years. Grace, at 4, was the darling of the family, charming everyone with her curly hair and infectious laughter. Eleanor watched her children growing and changing, feeling the bittersweet passage of time, the knowledge that the years of their dependence were fleeting, and soon they would make their own paths in the world. Tommy married in 1902, choosing a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a sensible young woman named Catherine who shared his love of the land and his commitment to hard work. The wedding was held at the ranch, with half the territory in attendance, and Eleanor sketched the entire event, capturing the joy and celebration. When Catherine became pregnant within months of the marriage, Eleanor felt the strange disorientation of becoming a grandmother at 44, still young enough to feel vital and energetic, but old enough to have a grandchild. The baby, a boy named Thomas after his father and great-grandfather, arrived in early 1903, and Eleanor held him with tears streaming down her face, amazed at the continuation of the family line, the way life kept renewing itself. Cord retired from the territorial legislature in 1904, ready to focus again on the ranch and his family. Arizona was on the cusp of statehood, and he had been part of the effort to make that happen, but he was tired of politics and eager to return to simpler pursuits. He and Eleanor spent more time together, riding out across their land, sitting on the porch in the evenings, talking about the past and the future. They had been married for over 20 years, and their love had deepened and matured, becoming something solid and enduring, a foundation that everything else was built upon. They still kissed every morning and every night, still held hands when they walked, still looked at each other with the same wonder they had felt that first evening on the rocky outcrop. Sarah announced in 1905 that she was leaving Arizona to study nursing in Chicago, determined to make her own way in the world. Eleanor supported the decision, even though it broke her heart to see her daughter leave. Sarah had inherited her mother's independence and her father's courage, and she would not be happy confined to the narrow roles available to women in the territory. They saw her off at the train station with hugs and tears and promises to write regularly, and Eleanor sketched Sarah standing on the platform, her bags at her feet, her face turned toward the future. Benjamin, now 16, had been accepted to an art school in San Francisco, and he would be leaving the following year. Only Grace would remain at home, at least for a few more years, and Eleanor treasured every moment with her youngest daughter, knowing how quickly childhood passed. In 1907, Tommy and Catherine had a second child, a daughter they named Eleanor after her grandmother. Holding this tiny namesake, Eleanor felt the circle complete in some fundamental way. She was 50 years old, her hair now liberally streaked with gray, her face lined by years of sun and wind and laughter, and she had lived more life than she had ever imagined possible that day in Boston when she bought a train ticket and fled toward the unknown. She had found love and partnership and purpose. She had raised 4 children who were strong and capable and kind. She had created art that mattered, that would outlast her physical presence. She had helped build something enduring, a ranch that would continue for generations, a family that was rooted in the land and in each other. Cord, now in his late 50s, was still strong and vital, though his hair had gone completely gray and his face was deeply tanned and weathered. He still rode out every day to check on the cattle and the hands, still worked alongside Tommy to make decisions about the ranch's future, still looked at Eleanor with eyes that told her she was the center of his world. They had survived challenges and celebrated triumphs together, had raised children and buried parents, had built a life from the raw materials of land and love and determination. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1907, Cord gave Eleanor a gift that made her weep. He had commissioned a leather-bound book containing copies of every sketch and painting she had done of their life together, starting with that first drawing of 2 figures standing side by side. "Our life together," he said simply, handing her the book. "Just like you drew it that first night." Eleanor paged through the book slowly, seeing their history laid out in images. Cord working with cattle, the children at various ages, the ranch buildings, the landscape in different seasons, celebrations and ordinary moments, everything that had made up their years together. It was extraordinary to see it all compiled this way, a visual testament to a life fully lived and deeply loved. "It is more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered, looking up at Cord with tears streaming down her face. "When you asked me to draw our life together that night, I had no idea how wonderful it would actually be." Cord pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I just knew that you were special, that you saw the world in a way that made it more beautiful. I wanted to be part of that vision, wanted to create something with you that mattered." "And we did, Eleanor, we really did." They held each other on the porch of the house they had built, watching the sun set over the mountains they had claimed as home, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life. The ranch that stretched to the horizon, the grandchildren playing in the yard, the sounds of family and work and continuity. Sarah would return from Chicago in a few years with her nursing degree and marry a doctor, settling in Prescott where she could be close to family while still pursuing her career. Benjamin would become a respected artist, teaching at universities and showing his work in galleries across the country, but always returning to Arizona for long visits, drawn back to the landscape that had shaped him. Grace would marry a lawyer from Phoenix, a good man who appreciated her intelligence and spirit, and she would raise her own children with the values Eleanor and Cord had instilled. Tommy would continue to run the ranch, expanding it further, passing it eventually to his son Thomas, ensuring that the Cordell name remained connected to this land for generations. But all of that was still to come. For now, in this moment, Eleanor and Cord simply stood together as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue, as the stars began to emerge in their thousands, as the desert night wrapped around them with its familiar sounds and scents. Eleanor thought about the young woman she had been, sitting on a rocky outcrop with a stick of charcoal and a dream of something more. She thought about the cowboy who had seen her sketching and recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood that life was meant to be lived fully and passionately. She thought about the leap of faith they had both taken, the way they had built a life together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. "Draw our life together starting right now," Cord had said all those years ago, and Eleanor had done exactly that, capturing each moment, each stage, each transition in her art. But more than that, they had lived it together, creating a story that was richer and more complex than any drawing could fully capture. The art was important, a record and a legacy, but the true masterpiece was the life itself, the love they had built and nurtured and protected through all the years. Looking at Cord now, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun, Eleanor knew that she would make the same choice again, would buy that train ticket, would sit on that outcrop, would say yes to the cowboy who asked her to draw their future. Because what they had created together was exactly what she had been searching for without knowing it. A love that was wild and tender, a life that was challenging and rewarding, a home that was both a physical place and a feeling of absolute rightness. As darkness fell completely and they turned to go inside, Cord took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers just as they had done that first night. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saying yes. For taking a chance on a cowboy who probably sounded crazy asking you to draw your life with a complete stranger." Eleanor squeezed his hand, smiling up at him with all the love she felt. "Thank you for asking," she replied. "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, and understanding what I needed even before I understood it myself. Thank you for 25 years of adventure and love and partnership. Thank you for our children and our life and everything we have built together." They kissed there in the doorway, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of history and promise. And then they went inside to the house filled with family and warmth and light. Maria had prepared a special dinner to celebrate their anniversary, and the table was crowded with loved ones. Tommy and Catherine and their children, Grace chattering excitedly about a book she was reading, ranch hands who had become like family over the years. They ate and laughed and told stories, and Eleanor looked around the table, committing every face to memory, storing up images for future drawings. This was what she had sketched that first night without fully understanding what she was creating. Not just two figures standing side by side, but a whole world built on the foundation of their commitment to each other, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Later, when the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Eleanor sat in her studio with her newest sketchbook, a stick of charcoal in her hand. Cord came to find her there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her work with the same fascination he had shown that first evening. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Eleanor turned the sketchbook so he could see. She had drawn the two of them as they were now, older and weathered but still standing side by side, still facing the future together. Behind them, sketched in lighter strokes, were the shadows of their children and grandchildren, the ranch buildings, the mountains, everything they had created. "Our life together," she said, echoing his words from earlier. Still drawing it, still living it, still grateful for every moment. Cord crossed to her, pulling her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you, Eleanor Cordell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you trying to capture that sunset. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her cheek. "Thank you for giving me a life worth drawing, worth living, worth celebrating. Thank you for being the best decision I ever made." They stood there in the studio surrounded by years of Eleanor's artwork, surrounded by the visual history of their love, and they held each other as the house settled into nighttime quiet around them. Outside, the Arizona desert stretched away in all directions, vast and beautiful and timeless, the same desert that had witnessed their first meeting, that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately become the canvas on which they painted their extraordinary life. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound lonely and lovely and somehow perfect. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and dust and Cord's familiar warmth, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she had drawn all those years ago when a cowboy asked her an impossible question, and she said yes. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Cord's health began to decline gradually in his early 60s, nothing dramatic but a slow wearing down, joints that ached in cold weather, stamina that was not what it once was. He refused to slow down significantly, still insisting on riding out to check the herds, still making decisions about the ranch's operations. But Eleanor could see the toll the years were taking. She adjusted their routines to accommodate his limitations, suggesting evening rides instead of dawn excursions, encouraging him to delegate more to Tommy and the foreman, making sure he rested when he needed to. He grumbled about being coddled, but she knew he was secretly grateful for her care. Eleanor's own body showed the effects of 50-plus years of life, her hands sometimes stiff with arthritis that made holding a pencil difficult, her eyes requiring spectacles for close work. But her mind remained sharp, and her passion for art undiminished. She continued to draw and paint, adapting her techniques to work with her body's limitations, and her later work took on a different quality, more contemplative and distilled, capturing essence rather than detail. Critics noted the evolution in her style, praising the wisdom and depth in her mature work. In 1912, Arizona finally achieved statehood, and the entire territory celebrated. Cord, who had worked toward this goal for so many years, attended the ceremonies in Phoenix with Eleanor beside him, watching as their home officially became part of the United States. It felt momentous, a recognition that the wild frontier they had helped tame was now a permanent part of the nation's fabric. They returned to the ranch after the celebrations, both feeling a sense of satisfaction and completion. They had witnessed and participated in the transformation of a territory into a state, had been part of building something that would last. Grace married her lawyer in 1913, a lovely wedding held at the ranch with all the family in attendance. Sarah came from Chicago with her husband and 2 young children. Benjamin traveled from San Francisco, where he was teaching at an art academy. Tommy's children, now including 3 boys and 2 girls, served as attendants and caused general chaos and delight. Eleanor sketched throughout the wedding, unable to resist capturing the beauty and joy of the occasion, and these sketches would later be compiled into a book for Grace, a record of her special day. As Cord entered his late 60s, he finally agreed to step back from the day-to-day management of the ranch, turning full control over to Tommy while retaining advisory status. It was difficult for him to let go, to accept that his working years were behind him, but Eleanor helped him find new ways to feel useful and engaged. He began writing down his memories of the early days, stories about his father and the founding of the ranch, advice about ranching and land management that he wanted to preserve for future generations. Eleanor illustrated his writings with her sketches, and together they created a family history that would be treasured by their descendants. They spent more time together in those years, just the two of them, rediscovering the companionship that had first drawn them together. They took slow rides across their land, stopping frequently to rest and admire the view. They sat on the porch for hours, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence when words were not needed. They played with their growing number of grandchildren, telling stories about the old days, passing on family history and values. Eleanor continued to draw Cord, fascinated by the way age had changed his face, adding character and depth to features she had loved for decades. She wanted to capture every version of him, to have a complete record of their life together. In the spring of 1918, Cord fell ill with pneumonia, a common ailment that was especially dangerous for someone his age. Eleanor nursed him tirelessly, refusing to leave his bedside, holding his hand through the worst of the fever, reading to him when he was conscious, praying when he was not. The family gathered, all the children coming home, bringing grandchildren, filling the house with worried whispers and forced cheer. For 3 weeks, Cord hovered between life and death, and Eleanor felt terror clutch at her heart every time his breathing became labored or his fever spiked. She was not ready to lose him, would never be ready, even though they had been blessed with 36 years together. But Cord, stubborn and strong even in illness, fought his way back from the brink. Slowly, gradually, the fever broke and his breathing eased and his strength began to return. Eleanor, exhausted from weeks of constant vigil, finally allowed herself to sleep, curled up in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. When she woke, she found him watching her, his eyes clear and alert for the first time in weeks. "Hello, my love," he said, his voice weak but unmistakably his own. "Did I scare you?" Eleanor burst into tears, overwhelming relief flooding through her. "Terribly," she admitted. "I thought I was going to lose you. I thought our story was going to end before I was ready." Cord squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. "Not yet," he promised. "We still have chapters to write, you and I. I am not leaving you until I absolutely have to." His recovery was slow but steady, and by summer he was well enough to sit on the porch and receive visitors, though he tired easily and needed frequent rest. He had aged noticeably during his illness, his hair now completely white, his face more gaunt, his movements more careful. But his spirit was unchanged, and his love for Eleanor burned as bright as ever. On their 36th wedding anniversary in October, he gave her a locket containing a tiny version of that first sketch she had done, the two figures standing side by side. "So you will always remember," he said, fastening it around her neck, "the moment our life together began." Eleanor wore the locket every day, touching it whenever she needed to feel connected to him, to that young cowboy who had asked her to draw their future. They had drawn it and lived it and made it real, and now they were in the final chapters, the bittersweet time when every moment felt precious because they knew how finite their time was. But Eleanor refused to dwell on endings. Instead, she focused on the present, on the gift of each new day, on the extraordinary life they had built together. The years after Cord's illness were gentle and sweet, marked by simple pleasures and deep contentment. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended christenings and school performances and graduations. They celebrated holidays surrounded by family, the house filled with multiple generations, noise and laughter echoing through the rooms. Tommy had taken the ranch to new heights of success, implementing modern techniques while respecting the land, and Cord was proud of his son's stewardship. Sarah had become head nurse at a hospital in Chicago, respected and admired for her skill and compassion. Benjamin's paintings were shown in major galleries and museums, and he credited his mother's influence for his artistic vision. Grace was active in Phoenix society, using her position to advocate for women's suffrage and other progressive causes. All of their children had become remarkable adults, contributing to their communities, raising their own families with the values Eleanor and Cord had modeled. On a warm evening in September 1925, Eleanor and Cord sat on their porch watching yet another spectacular sunset, 43 years after that first sunset that had brought them together. Cord's health had been declining slowly, inevitably, and they both knew that their time together was drawing to a close. But there was peace in that knowledge, an acceptance born of a life fully lived and deeply loved. "Do you remember," Cord said softly, "that first night when I asked you to draw our life together? Did you ever imagine it would be this beautiful?" Eleanor took his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm, the warmth of his skin. "I imagined something wonderful," she admitted. "But the reality exceeded anything I could have drawn. You gave me everything, Cord, adventure and love and partnership and family. You gave me a life worth living and a love worth celebrating. I would not change a single moment, not one single day of our years together." "Neither would I," Cord said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were the best decision I ever made, Eleanor. Asking you to stay, asking you to build a life with me was the smartest and bravest thing I ever did. You made everything better. You made me better. I love you more now than I did that first night, and I loved you completely even then." They sat in silence as the sun completed its descent, as the sky went through its familiar progression of colors. Eleanor knew she should be sketching this moment, capturing it for posterity, but instead she simply held Cord's hand and imprinted every detail in her memory. The warmth of the evening air, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the solid presence of the man she loved beside her, the feeling of absolute completeness and rightness. This was what she had been searching for when she fled Boston all those years ago. This was what she had found in the Arizona desert with a cowboy who saw past her charcoal sketches to the woman holding them. This was love and home and everything that mattered. Cord passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, his hand in Eleanor's, their children gathered around his bed. He was 72 years old, and he had lived a good life, an honorable life, a life full of purpose and love. Eleanor grieved deeply, feeling as though part of herself had died with him, but she also felt profound gratitude. They had been blessed with 43 years together, years that had been rich and full and meaningful. Not everyone got that. Not everyone found their person and built a life that was exactly what they had dreamed of. She had, and she would carry that gift with her for whatever time she had left. After Cord's death, Eleanor threw herself into completing a massive project she had been working on for years. A comprehensive visual history of their life together, combining her sketches and paintings with Cord's written memories, creating a book that told their complete story. She worked on it obsessively, driven by the need to preserve every detail, to create something their descendants could turn to when they wanted to know about the people who had founded this ranch, this family legacy. The work kept her going through the worst of her grief, giving her purpose and focus when everything else felt empty. The book was completed in 1927, a beautiful leather-bound volume containing hundreds of images and Cord stories, telling the tale of two people who found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary. Eleanor had copies made for each of her children, and she presented them at a family gathering on what would have been her and Cord's 45th wedding anniversary. "This is your history," she told them, looking at her children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren who were now appearing. "This is where you come from. Your grandfather and I wanted you to know how much we loved each other and this land and all of you. We wanted you to understand that life is short and precious, and that love is the most important thing we can create." Eleanor lived for another 8 years after Cord's death, remaining active and engaged despite her advancing age. She continued to draw, though her output slowed, and her later work focused on memories rather than present reality, sketching scenes from her life with Cord as though she could keep him alive through her art. She divided her time between the ranch and visits to her children, delighting in her many grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the early days of the ranch, about what life had been like in the wild territory that was now a state. She was beloved and respected, known throughout Arizona as an artist and pioneer, a woman who had helped build the state and left a lasting legacy. On a spring morning in 1935, Eleanor sat in her studio working on one final sketch. She was 87 years old, her body frail but her mind still clear, her hands still capable of holding charcoal despite the arthritis that gnarled her fingers. The sketch was of two figures standing side by side, watching a sunset, and anyone familiar with her work would have recognized it as a mirror of that first drawing she had done 53 years earlier. But this version was different. The figures were older, more substantial, surrounded by the life they had built: children and grandchildren, ranch buildings, mountains, the vast sky that had witnessed their love story. Eleanor added the final details with careful strokes, then set down her charcoal and looked at the drawing with satisfaction. It was complete. Their story was complete. She was found later that morning by one of her granddaughters, slumped peacefully over her drawing table, the finished sketch before her, a smile on her face. She had died as she had lived, creating art, remembering love, grateful to the last for the extraordinary gift of her life with Cord. At her funeral, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, the family displayed both sketches side by side. The first one drawn on that rocky outcrop in 1882, and the final one drawn in her studio in 1935. Together, they told a complete story from beginning to end, of a love that had transformed two people and created a legacy that would endure for generations. Tommy, now 65 and silver-haired himself, stood before the gathered mourners and spoke about his mother with tears streaming down his face. "She taught us that love is a choice you make every day," he said. "That partnership means supporting each other's dreams, not just your own. That family is the most important legacy we can leave." My father asked her to draw their life together, and she did, capturing every moment, preserving our history, making sure we would always know where we came from and who we belonged to. We are gathered here today to honor an artist, a pioneer, a mother, and a grandmother. But most of all, we are honoring a woman who knew how to love completely and live fully, who took chances and built something beautiful from nothing but hope and determination, and the courage to say yes to an impossible question. Eleanor was buried beside Cord on a hillside overlooking the ranch, in a spot they had chosen together years earlier. The headstone was simple but perfect, listing their names and dates in a single line. They drew their life together and lived it with love. As the family gathered around the grave, Sarah read from her mother's journal, entries that captured Eleanor's thoughts about love and art and the meaning of life. Benjamin had painted a portrait of his parents for the occasion, showing them as they had been in their prime, young and vital and deeply in love. And this painting would hang in the ranch house for generations, a reminder of the couple who had started it all. As the years passed, and the ranch continued to prosper under Tommy's management and eventually under his sons, Eleanor and Cord's story became legend. The books Eleanor had created, with her art and Cord's words, were treasured family heirlooms, passed down and pored over, keeping alive the memory of two extraordinary people who had found each other in the wilderness and built something that lasted. New generations of Cordell children grew up hearing about the cowboy who asked the artist to draw their life together, about the woman who said yes and never regretted it, about the love that had founded a dynasty. The ranch itself became a testament to their vision, growing and evolving but always remaining true to the values Eleanor and Cord had established. Respect for the land, commitment to family, integrity in all dealings, and the understanding that success was measured not just in acres or cattle but in the quality of relationships and the legacy you left behind. The house Eleanor had designed still stood, expanded and modified over the years but essentially unchanged. And visitors always remarked on the walls covered with her artwork, a visual history that made the past feel immediate and real. In 1982, exactly 100 years after Eleanor first sat on that rocky outcrop sketching a sunset, the family gathered for a centennial celebration. Descendants came from across the country, more than 200 people who could trace their lineage back to Eleanor and Cord. The celebration lasted 3 days, with stories and reminiscences, tours of the ranch, displays of Eleanor's artwork, and readings from Cord's memoirs. The youngest attendee was a 3-month-old baby, 6th generation, held by her proud parents as they stood on the porch of the house her great-great-great-grandparents had built. The oldest was Tommy's daughter Martha, now 92, who had clear memories of both Eleanor and Cord and could tell first-hand stories about what they had been like. On the final evening of the celebration, the entire family gathered on that same rocky outcrop where it had all begun. Someone had researched the exact date and time of that first sunset, and they assembled to watch the sunset together, recreating the moment when their family story had started. As the sun descended toward the mountains, painting the sky in golds and purples and reds, a great-great-grandson who had inherited Eleanor's artistic talent sat with a sketchbook, drawing the scene just as she had done a century before. And as the last light faded and the stars began to emerge, the family felt the presence of Eleanor and Cord, as real as if they were standing there among their descendants, watching with pride and love as their impossible dream continued into its 2nd century. The story of Eleanor and Cord became more than just family history. It became part of the larger story of the American West, of the pioneers who had settled the frontier and built communities from scratch, of the courage it took to leave everything familiar behind and create something new. Eleanor's artwork was displayed in museums, studied by art historians, celebrated as an important record of Western life from a female perspective. Cord's writings about ranching and land management were used in agricultural programs. Together, they left a legacy that extended far beyond their family, touching anyone who encountered their story and felt inspired by the power of love and partnership and determination. But at its heart, their story was simple. Two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who recognized in each other something essential and irreplaceable, who took a leap of faith and built a life together that exceeded their wildest dreams. It was a story about saying yes to possibility, about drawing your future and then living it with courage and commitment, about the transformative power of love that is grounded in mutual respect and shared vision. It was a story that deserved to be remembered and retold, generation after generation, because it reminded people of what was possible when you were brave enough to reach for what you really wanted. And so the story lived on, passed down through the family, shared with friends and strangers, preserved in Eleanor's art and Cord's words, embodied in the ranch that still thrived more than a century after its founding. The cowboy and the artist who had met on a rocky outcrop in 1882 were long gone, returned to the earth they had loved. But their love story remained as vivid and inspiring as ever, a testament to the idea that the best life is one lived fully and passionately, with someone who sees you and loves you and encourages you to become your best self. They had drawn their life together, and then they had lived it with grace and joy and enduring love, creating something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for than that?